What if we pivot? What if we pivot this whole situation?
Well, it is your podcast.
What if we stray just off course in the most ridiculous way?
How does this microphone work?
It
Can you
just
talk
works
into it
exactly
more?
like that.
Just like this?
Yeah, you're in the perfect position.
Perfect.
You look great, dude.
Thanks, man.
How are his levels?
Pretty quiet, but that's pretty standard, Chuck.
This is where you. This
That's
is,
why I was asking about the microphone.
This is where you come in.
I'm working on it.
This is where.
I'm working, actively pursuing.
Hey, we don't pay you to give up.
Make me louder. I don't want to have to use my business voice the whole time.
Alpha, double alpha.
Jen Jack's always like, I know when you talk in your business voice.
You're like, look, we're making a deal here, okay?
Yeah.
Business voice.
Okay, Phoenix, I'll
Watch
give you
out, Daddy
this.
means business today.
Business voice.
Mr. Business is what they call
Yeah.
me at home.
Did you want to pivot?
Well, I was writing a blog yesterday after a little hiatus, and Charles came up, and I thought that even though we were going to talk about wholesale pricing, that's kind of just an easy lob. But I had some deeper questions about coffee in general.
Oh, I was lured here under false pretense.
Well, you don't have to engage in this. This is something
You can get out.
This is something that I think everybody listening might find really interesting.
It's party.
You ready for this? Okay, great. Here's where we're setting the stage. Dulce came and talked to me yesterday about the SCA track. You know, how do you feel about the SCA
Oh,
track?
yeah, dude.
Like,
I told her to go talk to you.
right. What does it look like? Some people are really into it. There's all these courses, there's all this opportunity to learn, and some people are super bullish about it, and some people are just not into it. So what do you think about it? And I have, of course, a bunch of mixed emotions about it.
You were on the board and
Right. So
all the
back in
stuff.
2004 or whatever, whenever I discovered the SCA, I was really into it because a lot was different back then. There weren't a lot of places to get information and knowledge. Specialty coffee was like this tiny little whisper in the wind compared to what it is now. It just wasn't super prevalent. And you could argue that we're still a really small portion of the overall coffee industry. But the clipping point that I have in terms of where mainstream kind of comes in is 2017, Nestle acquires Blue Bottle for $425 million, like a 68% share. So that seems to be that's a good entry point to where it's like, okay, high-end specialty is now part of the mainstream culture. So that comes with a lot of different stuff. You know, add social media into the mix. There's a lot of places to get information. Yeah. You know, there's not only one place, SCA, where you can go. There's all these different places. But my main thing was, okay, what does her week look like? She works in green coffee, so she's cupping, she's interacting a lot with you. So my main thing was like, are you treating your interactions like Charles in the same way that you would treat a course that you paid $500 to go to? Because there's so much knowledge here in this building, and if we're just going through the motions of, oh, I'm just setting up another one of those, here's another cupping, versus you have an expert with you, let's pretend like you paid to be here. How does that change the way you interact with your work? And my argument is that's going to get you further faster than any kind of coursework will, because the coursework's so few and far between anyway.
For sure, finding the experts that are around you and engaging with them. I mean, that was kind of like my advice to her as well, is I think going to often be the best way to get the knowledge you want to have.
Yeah, and you can tap into those experts every day.
Yeah.
If someone made it a point to come sit with you for an hour every day, or not even just sit with, because we're all doing work, right?
Yeah.
But it's like you're both working in green coffee together in tandem. You're cupping coffees. You engage with that on a deep level. So I'm writing this, that's my whole thesis, right? And I'm writing it out, and then I'm getting to this point where I'm trying to explain who you are. Because there's me and there's Jared, and people are pretty familiar with us overall just because of the content that we've been creating for a long time.
Podcast number 12.
Right. And then you're a little bit more mysterious. So I was kind of taking this little snapshot of writing your bio, and I was trying to explain where you came from. And there's the Wall Street piece, but then the piece that I got to that was really interesting was how you came into specialty coffee.
Yeah.
So you were working for TechnoServe in Ethiopia and South Sudan.
Yep.
Which I'm just really, really interested in. And then also interested in the project that you were working on, where you were working on this project that helped South Sudan export the first coffee that they've ever exported ever? Or how does
Not
that
ever.
how
It
does that
was
work
Yeah, it was the first coffee that they'd exported as an independent country
as an independent country?
when they like broke off from like essentially got their independence from Sudan in 2011.
Okay.
And it was the first coffee that they had exported since maybe like the 70s. As part of Sudan, there was a lot of coffee that grew in in the southern part of Sudan, and they'd export it up the Nile and into the Middle East. So yeah, there was a good amount back then, but this project was essentially kind of trying to restart and revitalize a resource that they had in the coffee industry there.
So what you were working at TechnoServe, what is TechnoServe?
Yeah, TechnoServe is a nonprofit, an NGO, non-governmental organization that works with entrepreneurs and generally smallholder farmers and agricultural producers around the world. And many of their projects are used to improve, essentially through connections to markets and agricultural supports to like improve the quality and the quantity of the product that they are producing.
So it's not specifically coffee. They work with all kinds of
all
agricultural
kinds,
stuff.
which is really interesting. Like when I first started working with them, you can see all the job postings that come on, and it's like cashews in this country, or like working in like dairy in this country. So it's like it's the whole spectrum of agricultural products around the world, as well as then they also work with different types of like young entrepreneurs around the world as well.
So when you were giving up your Wall Street career, what drew you to working with coffee you started in Ethiopia, correct?
Yeah, that was where I started, but I was already there.
You were already there.
Yeah.
So you moved to Ethiopia before you worked for TechnoServe?
Yeah,
Okay.
totally. Yeah, because basically it was like, cool, I had this financial background and I wanted to use it for something that to me was more like soul filling than what I was doing before. And a friend of mine worked at the Nike Foundation, and she was talking to me one day about how their mission is to lift up girls and women around the world. That I didn't know that was like the mission of the Nike Foundation. And so I was telling her what I was trying to do with my background, and she was like, "Cool, let me see like what projects we're working on." She's like, "It sounds like you could be like an asset, in the NGO world where there's not a lot of people with like a deep financial background necessarily." So through her, I was able to interview for and land a job in Ethiopia, maybe like December 2010, related to working with or supporting like women-owned businesses and like the banking system that supports them, which is really minimal in Ethiopia at the time.
And so that was not coffee related, but was that still through TechnoServe? Or
No,
that was a
it
completely
was different. It was
thing?
this NGO called Women's World Banking. It's based
Okay.
in New York. They do great work all over the world.
And then what prompted the switch from that to TechnoServe?
Yeah, totally. So my girlfriend at the time, Jen, who's now my wife, like she was there with me, and we were both working at different NGOs. I was doing this project with Women's World Banking. She was working with an orphanage there. And my project lasted, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 months was the scope of that project. But we both really felt good about the kind of work that we were doing there and wanted to continue. And so I was reaching out to other people I knew in either Ethiopia or friends that I had that were outside of the US. And a friend of mine who was living in Kenya at the time, he was working with TechnoServe in Kenya on a coffee related project. So he was telling me about TechnoServe, and I was like, yeah, that sounds really interesting. And he was able to connect me with somebody, TechnoServe in Ethiopia, where they have their offices in Addis. So yeah, connection there, talk to those people, kind of. It was just, again, one of those things where like you're in the right place at the right time, because again, with TechnoServe, they're, part of their mission is like, they don't want a lot of like, white people from like the West over there, like running all their projects. It's like their mission is for their projects to be sustainably employed and run by by members of the countries where they're operated.
You're there to help. You're not the long-term solution.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it just happened that while I was there, there was a Russian woman who was super smart, a financial-backed Russian woman, and she was transitioning out, and they were just looking for somebody, again, as kind of like a stopgap measure for a little bit of time. And so I was able to come in and like fulfill that role, for the time that I was there.
So what was your interaction with coffee at that time, or is it mostly an office type job?
Yeah. I was based in the office in Addis to start, and I had this crazy spreadsheet that I had like partially inherited from the woman I replaced, and just I mean huge, like the biggest spreadsheet I've ever seen. And so my job was kind of getting a handle on that, and that spreadsheet kind of like tracked how the money and the coffee flowed from producer through exporting, which TechnoServe handled the exporting of the coffee, then to the buyers. Again, this is a different part of the coffee conversation, but the majority of the coffee that was bought through that program was by Starbucks and Pete's.
Sure.
Because the majority of the coffee that is produced in the world is not 88 or 90 point coffee, but 80 to 84 point coffee.
Right.
So Starbucks and Pete's were the two biggest buyers, and then you have people like Ritual, like Neumann's Group, like a lot of like the smaller, like Stumptown were like early buyers of the program. So the part of my work was tracking the money through all that, and then communicating with the banks, but also communicating with the co-op leaders. There are about 75 co-ops that TechnoServe was working with. And so communicating with the co-op leaders and ensuring that the money flowed, because the way the money then came in was through the government to the banks to the co-ops. And nobody really wants to let go of the money so easily.
So there's potential for it to not end up where it's supposed to be.
And then from the co-ops to the individual members. So there's a lot of like
Right. Okay. So
touch
recap
points.
that one more time. The money comes into the government.
Yes.
And then so
Stumptown
Starbucks or
or
Pete's would
Starbucks,
pay who do they cut the check to?
To like the
to Ethiopia.
to the exporting company
Okay.
that TechnoServe was working with.
Got it.
But then all of that money in some form like runs through the government. That's what maybe the exporting company has to like, in some way it comes through the government to the exporting company.
Okay. And then from there it goes to the co-op level.
Yeah, and it comes through the government again because the government has a really tight control on like Ethiopia's currency. Like it's not a currency that is just automatically, you can't just like, what is it like?
It doesn't have a standard exchange rate or something.
Well, yeah, the government sets the exchange rate. It's not like a market floating currency that, like when you're in Ethiopia, it's really hard to get dollars. So the government controls, like the currency and how it changes into other, from like the Ethiopian birr currency there into other currencies like the dollar or the euro. So in that aspect, like it has to flow through the government.
So here's this. Well, actually, finish that from So it goes through the government again.
Government, as it gets changed from dollars into birr, it flows through the government exporter, then from the exporter to the banks that are the local banks that are working with TechnoServe, and then from the banks to the co-op's account at the bank, and then from the co-op's account, it gets paid out to the individual members.
So there's 4 or 5 levels where things could go completely sideways, and the
definitely.
money might not end up where it needs to end up.
Yeah.
So this is a minor tangent here, but maybe you could talk a little bit about this, because one of the things that I remember when I started early on, because you're now in what, 2011 ish?
Yeah, early 2011.
Yeah. So the green buying is still kind of in its infancy. pioneered by maybe people like Dwayne or Jeff Watts or
Yeah.
So one of the things that I always heard about Ethiopia is that you basically can't get any direct trade coffee out of Ethiopia because of the way the government controls its exports.
Right.
So what are the nuts and bolts of that? Like, how did that
Yeah.
work?
At that time, TechnoServe got an exception from the government as like a trial program because I think early 2000s you were able, and people like Aleko and other people that I talked to, like there was a time early 2000s when you were able to work directly with different co-ops and entities. Maybe it was late 90s, early 2000s, but then the government came in and shut that down, and then for a period of time, and then TechnoServe was able to kind of get an exception to that government's rule, just based on kind of like a trial of like, hey, it potentially may be better for the producers to like bring this idea back, whereas like the government's intention was that by not allowing people to cherry pick producers, that more farmers overall would receive higher prices.
Got it. So it's almost like they're trying to flatten the curve.
Yeah, exactly.
Got it. Okay, so you guys got a little permission slip.
Yeah, exactly.
Nice.
Yeah, because it was a huge project. It was like a Bill and Melinda Gates funded project, and that foundation does a lot of different work in Ethiopia and the countries around there. It also worked with like the World Bank and a lot, like the International Finance Corporation, like a lot of really big, like world financing groups that had a lot of other work in Ethiopia. So, I think there were some reasons from like multiple entities why the government was willing to let TechnoServe try this out.
What were some of the things that you were thinking of or noticing? Like, did it change how you looked at coffee?
Yeah, I mean, this was my first dive, into coffee on any level, really. So yeah, I mean, again, for me, like coffee is like all about the people. So like meeting the people at each part of the chain, and as I was there longer, I also moved into a role where I was essentially kind of like advising the co-op leaders on how to like look at their co-ops as businesses, make sure support them and how they're kind of the P&Ls of the co-ops are run, what that money flow looks like, and just like your revenue and your expenses and that kind of stuff. So I just really enjoyed those personal connections as well as like the connections that I had with all the people, whether it was at the farm or co-op level, and mainly at the co-op level. There, again, a number of different people that were employed at each of the co-ops doing different, that are working with farmers, that are collecting from farmers, that are in charge of managing the P&L, and then, the co-op leader. It's like, so there were like a number of people employed at the co-op, and those were some of the people that I got to know better, as well as the people that worked like in the office with TechnoServe as well.
How were people receiving you? How was it did you have to build a great deal of trust, or, because you're an outsider
I'm like a
in
foreigner,
a strange
like
land, right?
Yeah, for sure. And and dude, it's just my personal experience, right? Is like that I never 100% feel, just as anybody that maybe comes from outside. There's like a word for foreigners, like Ferengi is like
Ferengi?
the Ethiopian Amharic word for foreigners. It is one of those things to be, somebody that's like viewed differently when you come in somewhere, which I think is something that is important for anybody. Man, I encourage like all young people to like go somewhere where they are really different. Like, I don't know, quick tangent on my end is like, dude, when I was like in my early 20s, I had the opportunity to travel to China with a friend of mine, like early 2000s. And again, just being somewhere where you're kind of like the only American, like there weren't a lot of other Americans traveling there. My friend spoke Chinese, as like another white guy, but just essentially like two people that in a very different culture from their own. And I think it's really important for people who, I don't know, who grow up in places where everybody looks like them to experience places that are not like that. And I think those are I think there's really important perspective for people to to experience.
Yeah, that's interesting too. Because there's the visual thing, like you look like me or you don't look like me, but then there's also this cultural thing as well that sometimes goes on these lines that you might not think it would go along. So
Yeah.
for example, some of the first origin travel that I ever did was to Colombia. And my experience there overall was pretty welcoming, where it's like even though people didn't necessarily look like me, everyone seemed really open and they were making an effort to kind of meet my broken Spanish where it was at and work with me on things. Whereas some of the other travel I did in those years, this was, 2006 ish, I went to Italy, went to Milan for the host show, and over there, people more or less looked like me, but they were not friendly at all. They made no effort to meet my even worse, attempt at Italian where it was at, and I got yelled at a couple times for just not being able to order my own coffee and food, and it was very not welcoming. So there's like the visual difference, but there's also this cultural difference where it's like I felt way more like an outsider in Italy than I did in Colombia, which was interesting as well.
And going back to being in Ethiopia, like a lot of what I experienced was just like curiosity and just extreme friendliness and hospitality for the most part. Like, just getting invited over to, to people's homes where they'd, maybe they have like a special dish that they make when, when they've got special events or visitors coming over and getting to experience that. Or even like personally, one of the things that I really remember was, there's a guy, Kokeb, that worked next to me a lot of the time. And so we'd talk a lot. And he was just really curious about the U.S. and my background, and I was curious kind of about how he grew up. And one of the things that a lot of like guys do as friends there is like they hold hands when they walk down the street, and it was kind of like it was really cool, like for me, like the moment in our relationship where like he like grabbed my hand to like hold my hand when we were walking down the street.
That's awesome.
And that was just like, again, just the things that I remember of like just feeling more accepted and just like when your relationships with people like start to feel comfortable with you, just like the cultural things that they'll like incorporate, cultural things that they incorporated me into.
Sure.
Once I'd been there like a little bit longer, like I was like, oh yeah,
You're like, I'm in, dude.
I have my hand today when we're
Sign
walking
of
down
trust.
the street. Dude.
That's fucking awesome.
Yeah.
Why this is turning into a little masterclass on Ethiopian coffee.
I know.
Why the co-op system in Ethiopia? Like, why are they so heavy with that?
Yeah, the co-op system works. I mean, as much as anything works well, the co-op system I feel like has been adopted in Ethiopia because it's one of those places where everybody, it's just part of the fabric of life there. Everybody grows just a little bit of coffee, right? Everybody grows half an acre, an acre. Like everybody has everybody has a little bit. Not many people have huge plantations or farms or fincas or really bigger properties. It's the majority of the coffee is just grown on these really small plots. So the co-op system is kind of a natural fit with that, in that the producers can bring the coffee to the co-op, and it can be what's the word I'm looking for, like all brought together in one place. It can be centralized. And
then what are the big differences between, let's say, a co-op in Ethiopia and a mill like, let's say, Bella Vista in Guatemala? Because they're both collection places where coffee comes together. What are the big differences there?
Yeah. I mean, right, they both serve as like centralized depositories and, the focal points for where the producers are kind of bringing their coffee, where they're going to receive their funds from. Man, I mean, in Ethiopia, it just often depends on the, like how, at Bella Vista, they've been doing it for like 30 years, right? So it's like, they've got everything down to a science. So in Ethiopia, you just experience like a wider variance of I guess the skill level in the people running the co-ops because there's so many. So a really well run co-op, is gonna run much more similarly to the collection side of Bay Vista in Guatemala. A newer co-op with like newer leadership, it may not be able to handle the operations in the way that obviously somebody that hasn't been doing it as long through no fault of their own just isn't able to operate in the same, maybe quality standards or with the same experience level as somebody that's been doing it for like 20 or 30 years. So I think you just see more of a variance there. And I mean, we had that at TechnoServe. It's like a lot of the co-ops did really well, but we had co-ops that failed. There were a few. We worked with 75. Like there were a few where there was, mismanagement or, other difficulties and challenges that happened that led to that. So I think with a co-op, again, it's going to be often much smaller than something the size of Bay Vista. Bay Vista, there's hundreds of people that work there. And usually with these co-ops, there's like 5 to 10 people employed there, and they're producers as well. It's not their main job. I think again that's another, as we're talking about it, another big difference is that everybody who's working at at the collection point of the mill at Bay Vista, it's like that's their job for the most part. But for a lot of the people who are running the co-ops that we worked with in Ethiopia, it's like their main job was that they were a farmer, a producer, and then this was additional.
Wow, that's interesting. Ethiopian coffee is so interesting because it's since I got into coffee, it was really, it's always really appreciated, but it's always kind of mysterious.
Yeah.
Where I remember some of the first cuppings that I did, and even like a lot of people's first introduction to cupping, it's like you're going around this whole table, and then you get to Africa, right? You get to these coffees that are they just seem to jump off a little bit more. And with a lot of the Central and South American coffees, you have coffees that are identifiable by the producer's name. Like this coffee came from this person, and some of the best coffees on the table are only identifiable at the co-op or regional level.
Yeah.
And that's been changing a lot because you've seen a lot of as I don't know much about their infrastructure, but the infrastructure in Central and South America is changing, and like the quality practices are changing. You get coffees that are, much more than just nougat and chocolate and what we would classically think of as those kinds of profiles.
Definitely.
But it's just really interesting to see some of those coffees where it's like it's Nano Genji, or this is from Yurgashev.
Yeah.
That was the hardest thing for me when we were switching over the bags, because the label design was really centered around the producer's name, because that was something in-house we would always talk about. We'd be like, refer to the coffee by its producer's name. And then you got to African coffees and they're like one word, like Rico. And I'm like, I got to make that look good on this label that was designed for 2 names, or like 2-word names. And it was just something that always threw me off, because I'm like, wait, no, whose coffee is it? Because I'm just used to that Central and South America. Oh, this is Benjamin, or oh, this is Damian Chavez's coffee. And it just threw me off. And I never really thought about it until I was redesigning the labels.
Yeah, it's just parts of the world where the co-op system is much more a part of like the structural foundation of like the coffee industry, right?
Yeah.
So how long were you in Ethiopia? A year or 2?
Yeah, I was there about a year, all in.
And then what prompted the switch to South Sudan? How did that work?
Yeah, so so just some quick background. South Sudan had been fighting a civil war with Sudan for a number of years. They finally won their independence in, I think, July 2011. And at that time, because the war had been going on, a lot of the NGOs that were there, so a lot of the people that are native South Sudanese were in refugee camps in surrounding countries in Uganda and Ethiopia, Kenya. And a lot of those people were coming back as South Sudan had their independence. And a lot of the NGOs that had been there supporting people were humanitarian based, but the government was reaching out to more more NGOs that were more livelihood based, right? More based on like working and supporting and developing livelihoods. And so recognizing that coffee had the potential to support people's livelihoods through like bringing the farming back that was happening previously in the South Sudan. I think that was where the connection with TechnoServe came, in that TechnoServe had helped develop this infrastructure in kind of remote areas in Ethiopia, right, in Western Ethiopia, where there wasn't really previously strong specialty coffee infrastructure. So that was kind of their idea, was to bring that type of infrastructure to South Sudan and kind of use that to help develop livelihoods as people returned from refugee camps and were looking for how you're going to make a life.
Right. So you got a brand new country, new independence, and then coffee is there, which has huge potential to be an export commodity and be a livelihood for the group of people. Yeah. And it's completely disorganized to start with, because there's just nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, I can imagine. Well, I can't imagine, actually. I can't imagine at all, being in a refugee camp, like all of a sudden you've gained your independence and it's like, okay.
Yeah.
Now what?
Yeah, and a lot of people went back to kind of where they were from originally to like survey what the damage was, what was still there, and try to come up with a plan for what livelihood could look like there.
Right.
And so how I got involved was TechnoServe was looking for someone to travel to South Sudan and essentially do like a countrywide survey to see if it would be logistically possible to start a program, right? Talking to the government, or liaisoning with the government, looking at infrastructure. What did the coffee? Nobody is super funny. Like the conversations I had in Ethiopia with people, like I was like, cool. So where is the coffee? And they like showed me a map of South Sudan, and they're like, we think there's some here, and we think there's some there.
Yes, dude.
But because the country had been at war for so long, it's like there wasn't any up and running,
inventory tracking.
There was just any up and running coffee industry, and any idea of what the infrastructure looked like, what the roads looked like, what transport looked like, and so they were like, we think there's some here, we think there's some there, we think there's some here. So that was part of what my job was whoever was going to take that job was to go into the country and survey those areas, see was there coffee there, what kind of coffee, what did logistics look like, would it be possible to set up a program. And so I was comfortable doing the logistical part because I travel very easily in like difficult places, and then they were going to team me with essentially like a coffee expert from Kenya, and that we were going to kind of be like a two-man team that went in to do like an exploratory mission to see if it was possible to set up a program.
Wow.
Yeah.
What did you find?
Yeah. So I was like, dude, as like I don't know, a 30-year-old, I love stuff like this, right? It's like I'd kind of like, I love, I don't know, you guys know, it's like I love maybe putting myself in more difficult situations than is maybe the best idea. So, right? It's like, I mean, you can't.
What did you find besides malaria?
Totally. Yeah. And it's like, I mean, the first thing I found was that like I couldn't take my girlfriend with me unless I found her a job, because no one could enter South Sudan without a work visa. So that was actually the first thing, was like, cool, I was able to go, but Jen and I essentially had to find her a job in South Sudan for her to be able to come with me. So that was like the first amount of work, was like in Ethiopia, looking through NGOs there that were looking for help, finding a job, applications, applying, all that stuff kind of had to go in to be able that she could come with me as well. And then, yeah, dude, landing in a place that was previously, so I landed in South Sudan 7 days after independence was declared.
Jeez.
Wow.
And It's wild. Like I landed not really knowing anyone. I had reached out to a few people through back then, like couch surfing was a way to kind of like travel around the world, right, and kind of meet people in different places. And there were a few like couch surfing profiles in, people can go look up what couch surfing is, right? It's like a way to.
When we first moved to Santa Cruz, the house that I lived at with 5 or 6 other people, we were set up on whatever couch surfing site was the popular site. So we often had an extra person in the living room.
Yeah.
Yeah, just it was a thing.
But in Juba, the
Airbnb for couches.
Yeah,
Basically.
exactly.
Yeah, essentially. But usually it's free. But in Juba is actually set up to where they would like charge you a certain amount. So it was like I was able to have some communication and at least have an address where I was gonna stay the first night there, because my counterpart from Kenya wasn't gonna arrive for like a couple weeks. So I landed in Juba. You essentially there's a United Nations, a main like United Nations base there, like a humanitarian aid base, and so you fly in to essentially what is like the United Nations land strip was being used as the airport at that time.
Wow.
And so you fly in there and so then I'm just there. And so essentially it was trying to find a way like, and there's just no infrastructure, right? And the money is super high inflation, so everything's super expensive. But yeah, just trying to find, essentially you're hopping on like a motorbike taxi, trying to find how to address and trying to find a phone that would work, essentially, right? You're trying to do all the things when you get into a new place, like SIM card, what does transportation look like? How do I change money, right? All those kind of like.
It's like a Jason Bourne movie.
Yeah, right? It's like.
It's getting set up.
The
You don't have your burn bag? Your go bag? For
I know. Kokeb would just call me Indiana Jones, and he'd be like, you'll be fine, like. But yeah, it's like those basic things when you get in a new place. It's a totally different place. It's like money, phone. I had an address, so this guy that was like, this 15-year-old kid that was my motor taxi guy was like taking me around, helping me find the address.
Hell yeah.
Trying to do all those things, changing money, stuff like that. And then yeah, it takes a bit of time to get set up, right? I mean, Juba is just a wild place, all kind of mainly all dirt roads, like lots of central markets, things like that. Also, it's too bad I don't have a lot of pictures from that time either, because it's actually illegal to take photographs.
Wow.
During the time that I was there.
Amazing.
Wow. And again, you see like the military everywhere, right? Trucks, guns, machine guns, military. So once I was there, like kind of first couple of days was just trying to make contact with other NGOs that were already there who like knew kind of like the lay of the land. And so I was able to essentially the first week there, like meet with a number of other NGOs who were very kind in sharing their time, like things like the Red Cross and like other humanitarian NGOs that are there, and kind of talk through. They got me set up with like there's like a weekly security briefing, because it is a place that was just like 7 days from a civil war, and there is still different militias and other groups that weren't part of the government. There were still shootings and things like that happened. So
right, there's no like clean end to a war where it's like,
not
cool,
like,
we're all good.
Yeah, it's not like utopia. It's just,
exactly.
It's like the government is being brought together, and so there's important things like that. Cool, you're in on the security briefings. The NGOs would kind of let me know what part of the countries they thought were safe or not so safe to travel to, places to stay that were safer. Just again getting like, cool, I got the phone and the money, idea how to get around. Then it's like, cool, what parts of the country can I be in, relatively safely, and talking to other people, getting like the lay of the land. And then my first real part of the work, once you get like set up there, is going to talk with the government, and then just starting to search for where the different parts of the coffee, like where the most coffee is. So is setting up meetings with like local agricultural ministers. I mean, even like the local state government level. So I had a meeting with like the head, like the newly installed, right? He'd been in the job for like 7 days, like agricultural minister. And so just trying to get contacts from him, like who, like, here's what we're, talking about. Here's what we're here to do as TechnoServe. Here's what we would like to do. We're here to essentially do a survey for coffee. Happy to provide you all the information that we gather. Based on your experience, like, where do you think the coffee is?
So, because at this point you haven't been hired necessarily, you're making a pitch to them in some sense.
Yeah, it's
right?
and
you're showing up and offering help, but it's not like they called for you to be there.
No, because it would be like funded by essentially like larger
donors
coffee, donors,
Yeah.
larger coffee companies that would be like exporting, that would be buying the coffee that was exported, essentially.
Right.
So this is to like gather all the information to propose them investing the money in creating the program, because the government, didn't necessarily have the money to create its own industries at that time.
And then so you're out on adventures trying to find coffee. Did they have some land reallocation? Did they know who owned this alleged coffee?
Yeah, so generally we went to visit places where people had come back from refugee camps. And so there's a place not too far from Juba called Yei. It's the spelling's like Yei, like the town of Yei, and it was like one of the bigger kind of towns in South Sudan. Again, the UN had a presence there, so it's like cool. You can stay at the UN camp. They like rented out rooms at like the UN camp, and so it's a lot of kind of using this like infrastructure that was kind of there from like a humanitarian side to then try. So I mean, this is the thing you're doing when you're trying to find people, is like you just go sit in the office all day. So when I was having a meeting, quotation marks, with like the National Minister of Agriculture, it was like that was just me finding out where his office was and sitting there all day. And then when he comes by, like
you're like,
hey, you got a few minutes? Can I talk to you?
Yeah, wow.
Or like, can I set up a meeting? So it's the same kind of thing then at like the state level. Doing that as well and trying to find the right guy to talk to. And it turns out that around Yei, there is a lot of coffee, like a lot of Robusta that was, that was part of that like exporting during the 70s process. So, and then by then it's like my partner from Kenya had come and we're going to visit. We're like somebody from kind of the state coffee department is like taking us around to visit like different farms in the area. And again, I can say farms, a lot of quotation marks here, because like the jungle had grown over all the coffee trees for the most part. So the people that were coming back from the refugee camps were out there, like literally one that we went to visit, he's just out there with a machete, like chopping his coffee trees out, like chopping the jungle off his coffee trees.
How long did the Civil War last?
30 years,
Jeez.
I want to say.
Heavy.
Yeah, it's wild.
So that was, like you're saying, they previously exported coffee in the 70s, so that shit hadn't been touched for that long. Wow.
Yeah, for like decades.
Holy crap.
Yeah, so, and it just, I mean, again, like, I should have probably been like better prepared. Like, I definitely could have been better prepared, just like the risks that are there. It's like, one is malaria. The guy was cutting out trees. There were just like snakes in the trees, like while he's like cutting them out.
Nope.
We're in like tall grass. I'm walking around and everybody there dresses nicely, right? So it's like I'm in like a dress shirt and pants, and we're just like tramping through the jungle.
Should be in some leather coveralls.
Yeah, dude.
to
I should
prevent
be
the viper bites.
Full Indiana Jones outfit,
Dang. And then, so, discovered some coffee, every part of the process seems incredibly challenging.
Yeah.
Even from just the stupid little tiny thing, sitting in the office to try to get a meeting with this, director of agriculture, which is something Did you start and stop that thing?
No, it's good.
Gotcha.
Sorry.
Like sitting in the office and getting that meeting, it just seems such a far cry from what we do now. It's like, oh, just book online. Just schedule your meeting ahead of time. Yeah, we'll see you next week. Your number is A3. Come on by.
Old
And
school.
yeah, old school. Like,
Yeah.
just the most basic stuff is already hard.
It's a lot of tracking down people, trying to find times when they're going to be in the office, like if they're going to be in the office. Maybe you're showing up multiple days trying to catch people, and then just trying to get some kind of averages, like how many trees are in this area, like what do we think the potential what do you think the yield per tree looks like visiting the farms and trying to trying to see like what the area, driving around and seeing how big is the area where we think coffee's growing around Yay, and like what do we think the yield of the trees are, so how can we compute what we think a potential harvest could look like.
So you're at TechnoServe, once you're in the midst of this discovery, making these estimates on how much coffee could be potentially produced.
Yeah.
You guys are setting up the mills, like you're setting up the washing stations, or are those already there?
No, they're not there, and we're not setting them up. We're purely doing like the exploratory mission of like trying to prove, or not, but I mean ideally trying to prove that there's enough coffee
for it to be viable.
Business.
Okay.
And that, because I mean the roads.
Hey, there's this industry that you guys didn't know about. You can
and just this. I mean, you just see the things that we would think would be the saddest things of just even agricultural products that we're growing there, like corn, just whole fields of corn, just like just rotting on the vine because there's literally no way to take it to market, and like there aren't really like established marketplaces. Like a lot of the products in South Sudan were actually imported through one of the main roads coming up through Uganda. So the coffee, that's like the irony, is like the coffee that you would often see in the marketplace in Juba was from Uganda, even though South Sudan has thousands and thousands of coffee, plants, millions of coffee trees, and so it's just, it takes time to develop the time and structure to like develop those markets and the logistics.
Wow.
Because just it would take so long to get places. All the roads were just, I don't know if I can describe, just like dirt roads, totally washed out. You're going like 2 miles an hour the whole time, right? So something 10 miles away is taking you 5 hours to get there.
Dang. So where did it land for you? I mean, I know you obviously ended up getting multiple cases of malaria. One was bad enough where you had to come home.
Yeah, but before that, I really enjoyed the work that I was doing. We ended up viewing the three main areas in South Sudan where there was coffee, and we actually did find, while the vast majority of it was Robusta, that we did find small areas of Arabica there. And we did find that like there were certain areas where it could potentially be viable with logistics to like set up for farmers to set up co-ops and to create a mill specifically around the town of Yei. And then doing that it was like that, doing that in a number of different areas. So all those things in Juba, meeting with like governments, it's like doing all that stuff in each of the states and counties and cities where there was, or towns where there was coffee, right? So we're doing it in Yei. Then there's another area called the Imatong Mountains that had a lot of coffee. Those little higher elevation, so people were interested in that because of the elevation. But also, I mean, we're like but the guy's like, yeah, I think there's coffee. It's like a 8-hour hike up this mountain.
Jeez.
And so it's like, all right, let's go. So it's like there used to be a road here.
Wow.
And then like over 30 years, the road has just grown into the jungle. And so we follow what like used to be a road across like a broken down bridge over a river, and that we're like scrambling across to where this old town where there was coffee just growing in the middle of the jungle around this town that used to be there that wasn't even there anymore. So it's like, there was some like Arabica there, and there was more Robusta like closer in to like the main town that we were at in the Imatong Mountains. But it's like that was the other area that had like potential. And then the one that's maybe more famous and I think there was a team from like, you hear about the team from like Texas A&M and UC Davis that went to South Sudan one time, and they focused on like the Boma Plateau was like kind of the third area, and that's this plateau in the east of South Sudan that essentially connects into Ethiopia.
Does
So,
Texas A&M have a coffee research center?
yeah,
I know
they
UC
do.
Davis does. I
Yeah.
didn't know Texas A&M had one.
Yeah. So there were some guys from there, and it was actually, man, I was talking to give me his name. He used to be part of Intelligentsia. He lives in Colombia now, works with Azahar. OG Greenbuyer for Intelligentsia.
Jeff Watts?
Yeah, Jeff Watts. Like when I was in Colombia last year, I was talking to Jeff because he had been part of that trip in South Sudan.
Oh, no way.
Yeah, so he had been part of the trip to Boma, like the Boma Plateau, with with group of like kind of coffee scientists that were going to see. Like I think it was more focused on like genetics and things like that of varieties that were there. But it was cool when I was in Colombia last year, talking with Jeff about kind of us both having been there. But I never made it to Boma, and that was crazy. Is like we essentially would have to get in like this like 2 or 3 seater little airplane, like essentially borrow. I think it was like, borrow another NGO's tiny little airplane, and they would like fly us out to the Boma Plateau. And I think my partner from Kenya ended up going out there, but I didn't.
I
didn't make it.
Like
I probably would have been heavily medicated on that airplane ride. But again, that's just kind of like you'd be landing on like the tiniest airstrip, probably just in a field or dirt or something like that. But this NGO went out there for the humanitarian side of things, so they were going to give us a lift. So it's really, it's just those are the kinds of things you're trying to do to like make it happen, and when it's truly like an exploratory, project like that.
And I saw that ultimately, so how many mills initially popped up? I think from what I read, it was 2013 maybe.
Yeah.
Nescafe made the first substantial purchase of coffee out of South Sudan.
Yeah, it was. And they essentially, just due to how little Arabica was found there, I think the idea was to start with more of like a high quality Robusta and work on getting the infrastructure set up to export that. And then potentially, over time, maybe you could move toward, a higher value, maybe like Arabica over time. But that was essentially, we kind of did our full report, kind of made our full report. That report was incorporated into the pitch to Nescafe, and eventually, was approved by Nescafe, and they made that investment for the mill that ended up around like the town of Ye, where there was like better infrastructure, not too far from Juba. That was for sure like the best spot to start the program. And then I think since then it's kind of been off and on. Again, it takes like kind of again constant support from government and local stakeholders to continue to make it happen. And so I just wish like nothing but the best in terms of like just trying to nurture that industry there.
Do you have any idea how it's currently going?
My understanding is that it's just kind of been off and on based on kind of government, how different groups have kind of been in charge government wise and what the support's been like, and just like violence levels and things like that, as it just hasn't been a totally peaceful, say, decade since
Still
I
pretty
was there.
tumultuous.
Yeah. So
too bad.
Yeah, but it's it's like the product is there, and it's just gonna take kind of everybody coming together to support the industry, which I would just love to be able to drink some South Sudanese coffee one day.
Maybe there's another adventure in your future, dude.
No, man. Yeah, I mean the end
Best
of
friends club in
the
South
end of
Sudan?
this story, right, is that I almost died. I had malaria. I almost died. I still have health complications to this day from that experience.
dang.
So it's like you know,
Because you had
there's-
multiple bouts, correct?
Well,
And then there was one that kind of sent you over the edge,
No,
or
I just
is that
had
not it?
so I only got malaria once. Shout out to George Clooney, who apparently has had malaria 3 times.
Oh, okay.
So respect.
The
you
goat
know?
of malaria.
Dude, that was also the funny side note, right? Is that like I would have been the guy because had I not got malaria, my wife and I really enjoyed the work that we were doing there, and we were planning to stay, and that if the project got accepted, that potentially I could be there, you know, as one of the team members of the project, to help get it up and running. And my girlfriend and my wife now, Jen, she was working with this really amazing Ugandan woman that was like rescuing like young women from essentially like sex trafficking and like helping bring them to like a safe place and helping them in school. And dude, she even I forget what her full name is, but she ended up even getting like a award, like a medal from President Obama like a few years
Wow.
ago for all the amazing work she did. And Jen really just was incredibly like soul filling work to support that program there. So it's like we really enjoyed being there for what we were doing, and would have been there longer. Just just with the malaria, that was just like
That'll do
the
it.
malaria, and then like the complications. It was really like complications that were specific to my body that forced just me to have to come back and return to the U.S.
And
So-
that brings us up to where we met. Because when you had to get a job in the U.S., that was where,
Yeah. That brought me back.
Chuck shows up.
Because I mean, again, it's you talk about things about Chuck, and it's just one of the things that I had to learn about myself was that I kept pushing myself to be in more difficult and challenging situations, like throughout my life up until I hit a wall.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's like, cool, I'm gonna go work on Wall Street, which is like incredibly challenging and demanding from like a time and just cultural point of view, the culture of working there. And then it's like, okay, cool, I don't want to do that. Okay, I'm gonna work outside the U.S. and start out in like New Zealand, Australia. All right, maybe then I'm gonna go to the Middle East. All right, from the Middle East, I went to Africa and like East Africa, and then from Ethiopia, cool, I'm gonna go to South Sudan, which is like 7 days off of like a civil war, and I kept pushing myself into more and more difficult more and more challenging situations, essentially until I hit a wall. And so that's like something that I learned about myself through the process. And just I think a really important thing for me to understand about myself, and just to, as like we all look at like personal development and look within ourselves about what drives us to do different things, like I am totally happy to hang out here and not put myself in maybe like an unnecessarily difficult, dangerous situation these days.
How do you see your work here in that regard? Because you're not in a dangerous situation necessarily, but running a business isn't a cakewalk. You know, it's not like it's without risk. It's not like we work for someone and this is a sure thing and we have a pension and all this stuff.
Yeah,
and
measure it in like stress levels, right? I'm sure you feel that too.
Yeah, so I'm curious because it's not clear
different
to
kind of-
me that you're in a safer place. Physically, for sure, you're in a safer place. Absolutely.
Totally.
Mentally.
But career-wise, I mean, it can be completely different. You
Yeah,
know?
and I mean, it's like there's different things that can evoke stress, right? Like me being in South Sudan and hearing gunfire outside my house can evoke stress.
Yeah.
Or us running a business, and I don't know what a good example would be. Like,
Well, I know.
Gunfire
I'll give
outside
you
of
one. I'll give you
Our
one.
cafes.
Yeah.
So I mean, with every cafe, every section of the business has its own financials, and then those all boil down to some sort of bottom line.
Yep.
And then one of the things that you've been pushing us to do is, here's a cash position that we need to have, no matter what, because interestingly enough, as you grow as a business and you're even making more money, things are much more volatile. So the cash position increases, at almost this like exponential clip to where we have to be able to buffer more things.
Exactly.
And if that's not right, you're not sleeping at
Yeah.
night. And I know that from experience.
Yeah.
To where
Yeah.
like our cash position has been XXX, and
Like,
I'm just
in
I
the
can't
past,
even
yeah.
function. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's been some of our big work to do.
I'm
So that's just
sleeping-
one
I'm
example.
sleeping better these days. But yeah,
Right.
there was times, and especially like during the pandemic is like an easy
Right. What the
And-
hell is going on?
an easy example to point to as well, where where it's like the stress that your body is feeling is directly resulted to the business, right? To like our job and the business we have. So yeah, it's like the stress still comes, and then it's just trying to work within the tools and resources, I guess, that we have to try and reduce that stress to like a manageable level.
Right.
Which I feel like we've done a really good job of over the past couple of years. That maybe we were pushing pretty hard in the beginning. I think as anybody does that's trying to start a new business and carve out a place for themselves,
Mm-hmm.
there were really stressful times, and I think over the last few years we've done a good job of using tools and resources to and just over time what we've learned in starting and operating this business to hopefully put in some of those like safeguards and reduce some of the stress that maybe we were feeling before.
Yeah. I'm proud of what we've done over the past year and a half specifically, and we got a lot more to go, but it
Yeah.
feels good. And that's probably a whole another podcast in its own right.
Yeah, it could be for sure.
Dude, thanks for talking. That's super interesting. I learned a few things, and I know other people will find it really interesting.
Yeah,
The
dude,
world of
thanks.
coffee is this wild wormhole, and you got a really cool insight to a specific piece of it that I don't hear about a lot. So,
Yeah, dude, thanks for having me.
hell yeah.